At the inheritance meeting, my daughter-in-law said, "You should be ashamed to show up here without contributing anything." Everyone laughed until the lawyer said, "All of this exists because she signed the loan in 1986. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Karen and I'm 66 years old. I never thought that sitting in a lawyer's office would feel like standing before a firing squad. But there I was, surrounded by my own family, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a chasm. On one side sat my two sons, Michael and David, their wives flanking them like protective shields. Ava, David's wife, kept shooting me looks that could freeze water. On the other side, Robert, our family attorney for over 20 years, shuffled through papers with the solemnity of a funeral director. It had been 3 months since Harold passed away. 3 months since I lost the man I'd spent 42 years of my life with. You'd think that would earn me some compassion from his children, but compassion seemed to be in short supply that gray October afternoon. Before we begin, Robert cleared his throat, I want to remind everyone that this is a formal legal proceeding. The will is clear and comprehensive. Ava leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table. She was 38, blonde, and had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "I just think we should address the elephant in the room," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I felt my stomach clench. I'd known this was coming. Ever since the funeral, I'd sensed the whispers, the sidelong glances, the way conversation stopped when I entered a room. "What elephant?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what his sister-in-law meant. Ava's smile turned razor-sharp. "Well, I just think it's interesting that someone who never contributed anything to building this family's wealth suddenly expects to inherit half of everything." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of my chair, my knuckles turning white. "Excuse me." "Oh, come on, Karen." Ava's voice rose, abandoning any pretense of politeness. "Let's be honest here. Harold worked his entire life to build that company. He traveled, he sacrificed, he put in 18-hour days. And what did you do? You stayed home, played house, and spent his money." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. Around the table, I saw nods of agreement. My own sons, the children I'd raised, fed, comforted through countless nightmares and skinned knees, were nodding along with this woman's assessment of my life. "That's not fair," I managed to whisper, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "Isn't it?" Ava stood up now, pacing behind her chair like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You never had a real job. You never brought in income. You lived in that beautiful house, drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, all paid for by Harold's hard work." David, my younger son, shifted uncomfortably but didn't contradict his wife. Michael just stared at his hands. "These were my children and they were letting this happen. You should be ashamed," Ava continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Showing up here expecting to cash in on a fortune you had nothing to do with creating. It's honestly disgusting." The conference room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on Robert's bookshelf. I felt tears threatening, but I refused to give them the satisfaction. 42 years of marriage, 42 years of partnership, reduced to this moment where I was being called a gold digger by my own family. "Is that what you all think?" I asked, looking around the table. "That I was just some parasite living off Harold's success?" Michael finally looked up, but his expression was more uncomfortable than supportive. "Mom, nobody's saying you were a parasite. It's just, well, Dad did build the company from nothing. He was the one taking the risks, making the deals." "The risks," I repeated slowly. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "Exactly," Ava jumped back in. "Harold mortgaged everything, bet it all on his vision. While you were safe at home, he was out there fighting to make something of himself." I thought about 1986. I thought about the young woman I'd been, barely 24, standing in this very law office with Harold. I thought about the papers I'd signed, the promises I'd made, the future I'd risked for a man I loved and the family we were building together. But how could I explain that to people who had already made up their minds about who I was and what I deserved? "You know what the worst part is?" Ava wasn't finished. "You're sitting there acting like you're entitled to this inheritance. Like you somehow earned it by being married to Harold. Marriage isn't a job, Karen. It's not work. It's just existing. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every year I'd spent supporting Harold's dreams while putting my own aside. Every business dinner I'd hosted, every client I'd charmed, every crisis I'd helped him navigate behind the scenes. Every night I'd waited up for him to come home from another business trip, another late meeting, another emergency that required his attention more than his family did. But to them I had just existed. I think, Robert interrupted gently, we should proceed with reading the will. There will be time for discussion afterward. Ava sat back down, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She'd said what she came to say, delivered her verdict on my worthiness. Around the table my family avoided my eyes, their silence speaking louder than any words could. As Robert began to read Harold's final wishes, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not just heartbreak, though that was certainly there. Something deeper. Something that had been building for decades without me even realizing it. I was done being invisible. I was done being dismissed. And I was definitely done letting this family treat me like I was nothing more than a burden they'd inherited along with Harold's estate. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this inheritance they were so eager to claim existed because of a decision I'd made 40 years ago. A decision that had cost me everything I'd worked for and saved for up to that point. Soon they would learn the truth about who had really taken the risks in this family. That night I sat in my empty house surrounded by 42 years of memories, and let myself remember 1986. Really remember it, not the sanitized version I'd let myself believe over the decades. I was 24 then, a high school English teacher with dreams bigger than my small-town salary could support. I'd been saving every penny for 3 years, living with 2 roommates in a cramped apartment, driving a car that needed prayer more than gasoline. My goal was simple. Save enough to eventually open my own tutoring center, maybe even write the novel that lived in the back of my mind. Harold was 26, handsome in that confident way that made you believe anything was possible. He graduated with a business degree and big plans, but no money to back them up. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a secretary. There was no family money, no trust fund, no safety net. Just ambition and the kind of charm that made investors want to believe in him. We'd been dating for 2 years when he came to me with his proposal. Not a marriage proposal, that would come later. This was business. "Karen, I need your help," he'd said, sitting across from me in our favorite diner, his coffee growing cold as he spread papers across the sticky table. "I found the perfect opportunity. There's this small manufacturing company going under. The owner wants to sell, and I know I can turn it around." I'd listened as he explained his vision. Modernizing their equipment, expanding their client base, building something that could provide jobs for dozens of families. His eyes lit up when he talked about it, and I felt myself getting swept up in his enthusiasm. "The problem is," he continued, his voice dropping, "no bank will lend to me. I don't have enough collateral, enough credit history. I need someone to co-sign, someone with assets." My stomach had twisted then, though I didn't fully understand why. "What kind of assets?" "Your house," he said quietly. "The one your grandmother left you." I'd inherited my grandmother's small house when I was 21. It wasn't much. A 2-bedroom bungalow in an older neighborhood, but it was mine. Completely paid off, completely mine. It represented security, independence, the foundation for my own dreams. "Harold, I don't know anything about business," I'd protested. "What if something goes wrong?" He'd reached across the table and taken my hands in his. "Nothing will go wrong. I promise you, Karen. This is our future I'm talking about. Not just mine, ours." The word ours had done something to my resolve. We'd been talking about marriage, about building a life together. When he said ours, I'd seen children running through the yard of a bigger house, family vacations, security for the family we'd create together. "I'll pay you back within 5 years, he'd promised. "With interest. And once the company takes off, you'll never have to work again unless you want to. You can write your book, open that tutoring center, whatever you want." 3 weeks later, I'd sat in Robert's office, yes, the same Robert who just witnessed my humiliation, and signed papers that made my grandmother's house collateral for Harold's business loan. $60,000, which might as well have been $1 million in those days. But that wasn't all. Harold needed more than just collateral. He needed operating capital, money to buy inventory, to make payroll for the first few months while he turned the company around. "How much do you have saved?" he'd asked me one evening as we walked through the downtown area he dreamed of revitalizing. "About 15,000, I'd admitted. It represented every sacrifice I'd made since graduating college. Every night I'd stayed home instead of going out, every vacation I'd skipped, every piece of clothing I'd worn until it fell apart." "That's perfect," he'd said, stopping suddenly and turning to face me. "Karen, I know this is a lot to ask, but what if you invested that money in the company? As a partner, you'd own part of it, have a say in how it grows." I'd felt a flutter of excitement then. A partnership meant I wouldn't just be supporting his dream. I'd be part of it. Really? I'd be a partner. "Of course," he'd said, kissing my forehead. "We're a team, aren't we?" So I'd invested my entire life savings into Harold's company. $15,000 that represented 3 years of sacrifice and careful planning. The paperwork had been complicated, full of legal language I didn't fully understand, but Harold had assured me it was all standard. "Just remember," he'd said as we left Robert's office that day, "it's probably better if we don't mention your involvement to investors or clients. You know how it is. Some of these old-fashioned guys might not take the company seriously if they think a woman is helping run it." I'd nodded, understanding. It was 1986, after all. Women were still fighting for respect in the business world. It made sense to keep my involvement quiet, at least until the company was established. "Besides," Harold had added, "once we're married, what's mine is yours anyway, right?" What I didn't know then was that what's mine is yours apparently only worked in one direction. The company had succeeded beyond Harold's wildest dreams. Within 2 years, he'd expanded into 3 different product lines. Within 5 years, he was employing over 100 people. Within 10 years, he was the largest employer in our county. And I had quietly faded into the background of his success story. The partnership papers I'd signed had somehow evolved into a simple spousal investment. The collateral I provided became Harold's collateral. My $15,000 became Harold's startup capital. My house became our house, and then eventually, Harold's house's family money became muddled and my individual contribution disappeared into joint accounts and shared assets. I'd never complained. I'd been proud of his success, proud of our family's growing prosperity. When he'd insisted I quit teaching after Michael was born, I'd agreed. When he'd suggested I focus on being a wife and mother instead of pursuing my own career, I'd seen the logic in it. After all, the company was doing so well. And the company was ours, wasn't it? What did it matter whose name was on the paperwork? Now, sitting in my living room 4 decades later, I finally understood what had happened. I hadn't been Harold's wife in the eyes of his business success. I'd been his first investor, his initial partner, the person who'd made everything possible. And then I'd been erased from that history so completely that even my own children didn't know the truth. The worst part wasn't that Harold had taken credit for my contributions. The worst part was that I'd let him. I'd been so eager to support his dreams, so willing to sacrifice my own independence for our shared future, that I'd handed over not just my money and my property, but my identity as well. Tomorrow, when Robert finished reading Harold's will, my family would learn something that might shock them. But tonight, I was finally admitting something to myself that was even more shocking. I wasn't the helpless widow they thought I was. I wasn't the woman who'd lived off Harold's success. I was the woman who'd made Harold's success possible in the first place. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. As I made my coffee in the kitchen Harold had renovated 3 times over the years, I found myself remembering not just 1986, but all the years that followed. All the ways I'd continued to build his empire while disappearing from its story. Michael was born in 1988, just as the company was really taking off. I remember Harold coming home from the hospital, his face glowing with pride as he held his son and saying, "Now I really have something to work for." I'd smiled then, exhausted from 18 hours of labor, and agreed. Of course he had something to work for. We had something to work for. What I didn't anticipate was how completely that something to work for would consume him. Within 6 months of Michael's birth, Harold was traveling 3 days a week. New clients, he explained. Expansion opportunities. The company was growing faster than he'd ever imagined, and he needed to strike while the iron was hot. I hate leaving you with the baby, he'd say as he packed his suitcase for another trip to Chicago or Atlanta or wherever the next big deal was waiting. But this is temporary. Once we're really established, I'll be home more. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I wanted the company to succeed as much as he did. It was our future, our security, our children's inheritance. So I handled the nights when Michael had colic and screamed for hours while Harold was in hotel rooms 3 states away. I figured out how to change diapers and answer business calls at the same time when clients called the house because Harold was unreachable. I learned to host dinner parties for potential investors with a baby on my hip and a smile on my face. Karen's amazing, Harold would tell his business associates as I served them drinks and made small talk about their wives and children. I couldn't do any of this without her. But when the local newspaper wrote an article about Harold's success story 2 years later, I wasn't mentioned at all. The photo showed Harold standing in front of his factory, arms crossed, looking every inch the self-made man. The article talked about his vision, his risk-taking, his determination to build something from nothing. There was no mention of the woman who'd provided the collateral that made his first loan possible. No mention of the $15,000 that had kept the lights on during those first crucial months. No mention of the wife who'd handled every crisis at home, so he could focus on building his empire. When David was born in 1991, the pattern was already set. Harold was traveling more than ever, sometimes gone for entire weeks at a time. The company had expanded into 3 states, and he was personally overseeing every new location. "I'm building something big, Karen," he'd say during our brief phone conversations while he was on the road. "Something that will set our boys up for life." And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. So when he missed Michael's first steps because he was closing a deal in Texas, I took a video to show him when he got home. When he missed David's first words because he was touring a potential acquisition in Florida, I taught David to say "dada" over and over until Harold returned. I became an expert at being both parents. I went to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every little league game. When Harold made it to these events, which wasn't often, he was treated like a visiting celebrity. Teachers and other parents would fawn over him, talking about what an inspiration he was, how lucky we were to have such a successful husband and father. I'd stand beside him holding the camera, taking the pictures, making sure everyone felt welcome and appreciated. The perfect supporting wife. But here's what nobody saw. The nights I sat up balancing the company's books because Harold was too busy with the big picture to handle the details. The weekends I spent entertaining his business partners' families while he talked deals. The decisions I made about everything from office supplies to employee benefits, because Harold trusted my judgment, but didn't want to be bothered with the small stuff. I wasn't just his wife during those years. I was his unpaid CFO, his social coordinator, his crisis manager, and his full-time public relations department. When employees had personal problems, they came to me. When clients needed special attention, I handled it. When investors brought their wives to company events, I made sure they felt included and valued. "You're so lucky Harold lets you be involved," other wives would tell me. "My husband never talks business with me. Let me be involved." As if my involvement was a gift Harold had given me, rather than the foundation everything else was built on. The boys grew up seeing their father as this larger-than-life figure who swooped in with expensive gifts and exciting stories from his travels. They saw me as the one who made them do homework, who enforced bedtime, who said no when they wanted something unreasonable. Harold was the fun parent. I was the responsible one. Harold was the successful one. I was just mom. When Michael graduated high school in 2006, Harold gave a speech at the graduation party about how proud he was of his son, how excited he was to see Michael follow in his footsteps at the company. "Your dad built something amazing," Michael told me later that night as we cleaned up after the party. "I hope I can live up to his example." I'd smiled and hugged him, but inside I felt a familiar ache. Harold had built something amazing, yes, but he hadn't built it alone. The same thing happened when David graduated 2 years later. All the focus was on Harold's accomplishments, Harold's legacy, Harold's example for his sons to follow. By then, the company was worth millions. We lived in a house that had been featured in architectural magazines. We belonged to the country club, took vacations to Europe, drove cars that cost more than some people's houses. And everyone, including my own children, believed that this lifestyle was entirely due to Harold's brilliance and hard work. When Harold had his first heart attack in 2012, I was the one who managed the company for 3 months while he recovered. I knew every contract, every client relationship, every operational detail. The company didn't miss a beat, because I've been effectively co-running it for over 20 years. But when Harold returned to work, the story everyone told was about his remarkable recovery, his determination to get back to the business he'd built. Nobody mentioned that the business had run perfectly fine under my management. Nobody seemed to notice that maybe, just maybe, I knew what I was doing. That's when I started to feel invisible in my own life. Not just overlooked or underappreciated, but actually invisible. Like I was a ghost haunting the edges of Harold's success story. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 26 years building a life where my husband could focus entirely on his career, where my children could grow up secure and confident, where everyone around us could prosper and thrive. And in return, I disappeared so completely that my own family thought I'd contributed nothing. Sitting in my kitchen that morning after the humiliation in Robert's office, I finally understood why Ava's words had cut so deep. It wasn't just that she was wrong about my contributions. It was that she was saying out loud what my own family had been thinking for years. The second day of will reading was supposed to be routine. Robert had explained that Harold's estate was complex enough to require multiple sessions, and I'd steeled myself for another round of uncomfortable stares and whispered comments from my family. I arrived at Robert's office 15 minutes early, determined to maintain whatever dignity I had left. The same mahogany conference table, the same uncomfortable chairs, the same feeling that I was on trial for the crime of existing. Ava walked in wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her confidence radiating like heat from a furnace. She took her seat across from me, that same smug smile playing at her lips. "Good morning, Karen," she said with false sweetness. "I hope you've had time to think about what we discussed yesterday." I met her gaze steadily. "I've had time to think about a lot of things, Ava." Michael and David filed in with their usual uncomfortable expressions, followed by David's wife Jennifer, who'd been conspicuously absent the day before. Jennifer had always been kinder to me than Ava, but even she seemed to avoid eye contact as she took her seat. Robert entered carrying a thick file folder and a box I didn't recognize. His expression was more serious than usual, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like anticipation. "Before we continue with the will," Robert said, settling into his chair, "I need to address something that came up yesterday. There seems to be some confusion about the origins of Harold's company and Mrs. Holloway's role in its founding." Ava leaned back in her chair, clearly expecting this to be a formality. "I think we covered that pretty thoroughly yesterday." "Actually," Robert said, opening the file folder, "I don't think you did." He pulled out a stack of papers that looked yellowed with age. "These are the original incorporation documents for Holloway Manufacturing, filed in March of 1986. My heart started beating faster. I remembered those papers, remembered sitting in this very office as a young woman, signing document after document while Harold squeezed my hand reassuringly. "As you can see here," Robert continued, pointing to a line on the first page, "the company was founded with an initial capital investment of $15,000. "Right," Michael said. "Dad's startup money." Robert looked at him over his reading glasses. "Actually, Michael, this investment was made by your mother." The room went dead silent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "What do you mean?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert pulled out another document. "This is the loan agreement for the initial business purchase. As you can see, the collateral listed here is a residential property at 15 Oak Street, owned by..." He paused for effect. "Karen Elizabeth Manning, your mother's maiden name." Ava's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Harold built that company from nothing." "Harold built that company," Robert corrected, "with $15,000 in startup capital provided by your mother, using her house as collateral for a $60,000 business loan." He spread more papers across the table. Bank statements, investment records, property transfers. A paper trail that told a story nobody in my family had ever heard. "Furthermore," Robert continued, his voice gaining strength, "according to these partnership agreements, Mrs. Holloway was listed as a founding partner in Holloway Manufacturing, with a 30% stake in the company. I felt dizzy. 30%. I'd forgotten about that detail, buried under decades of joint accounts and shared assets in Harold's insistence that what was his was mine and what was mine was his. 30%? Jennifer spoke for the first time, her voice full of disbelief. That's right, Robert said. Your mother-in-law wasn't just Harold's wife. She was his business partner and primary investor. Ava stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. If Karen was a partner, why wasn't she involved in running the company? Why didn't anyone know about this? Robert pulled out yet another document. Because in 1989, Mrs. Holloway signed papers transferring her partnership stake to her husband in exchange for what the agreement calls equitable consideration within the marriage. I remembered that day now, though it had seemed insignificant at the time. Harold had explained that they needed to simplify the company structure for tax purposes, that having two owners made things complicated. He'd assured me that giving up my official partnership stake was just a paperwork change, that nothing would really be different. What does that mean exactly? Michael asked. It means, Robert said, looking directly at me, that your mother gave up her legal claim to 30% of the company in exchange for the promise of being provided for as Harold's wife. The weight of what had happened was starting to sink in around the table. I'd given up millions of dollars in equity for the promise that Harold would take care of me, a promise that had effectively erased my contribution from the company's history. But Robert wasn't finished. However, he said, opening the box he'd brought, Harold apparently kept very detailed records of your mother's continued contributions to the business. He pulled out ledger after ledger, bound volumes that looked like they'd been meticulously maintained for decades. What are those? David asked. These are Harold's private business records, Robert explained. He documented every major decision your mother influenced, every client relationship she managed, every crisis she helped resolve. According to these records, Mrs. Holloway was effectively acting as an unpaid executive for the entire 40-year history of the company. He opened one of the ledgers and began reading. 1992. Karen negotiated the Johnson account renewal, saving company $200,000 in potential losses. 1995. Karen's recommendation to expand into automotive parts proved crucial to company growth. 2003. Karen managed Henderson crisis, preventing lawsuit that could have bankrupted company. The entries went on and on. Decades of contributions I'd made, decisions I'd influenced, problems I'd solved, all documented in Harold's careful handwriting. A secret record of my invisible partnership. Why would Dad keep records like this? Michael asked, his voice strained. Robert closed the ledger and looked around the table. I think Harold knew that someday, people might question your mother's contributions to the family's success. These records prove that she wasn't just along for the ride. She was driving. Ava sank back into her chair, her confident demeanor cracking for the first time. But she never had a title, never drew a salary. Because she was married to the owner, Robert said simply. Her compensation came in the form of the lifestyle the company provided. But make no mistake, she earned every penny of it. I felt tears starting to form, but for the first time in 2 days, they weren't tears of humiliation. They were tears of validation. Harold had seen my contributions. He'd valued them enough to document them, to preserve evidence of my role in building our life together. There's more, Robert said quietly. In Harold's personal papers, I found a letter addressed to the family. He asked me to read it if anyone ever questioned Karen's right to inherit from his estate. He pulled out an envelope with Harold's familiar handwriting on the front. My hands were shaking as I watched him open it. Dear family, Robert began reading. If you're hearing this letter, it means someone has suggested that Karen doesn't deserve to share in the success we built together. I want you to know that every achievement attributed to me was actually achieved by us. Karen didn't just support my dreams. She made them possible. She invested her money, her house, her entire future in a business plan that existed only in my imagination. For 40 years, she was my partner in every sense of the word, even when business customs of the time made it impossible to give her the public recognition she deserved. Everything I accomplished, we accomplished. Everything I built, we built. If you take nothing else from my death, please take this. Your mother is not a beneficiary of my success. She is the co-creator of it. The conference room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on Robert's bookshelf. Around the table, my family stared at the papers, the ledgers, the evidence of a story they'd never known. Finally, Ava broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. I had no idea. I looked at her, this woman who'd humiliated me 24 hours earlier, and saw something I'd never seen before in her eyes. Respect. And maybe, just maybe, a little fear about what this revelation meant for her own position in the family. The 3 days that followed Robert's revelations were unlike anything I'd experienced in my 66 years. My phone rang constantly. Flowers arrived at my door. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to the woman they'd dismissed just a week earlier. Michael was the first to call, less than 2 hours after we'd left Robert's office. Mom! His voice was strained, unfamiliar. Can we talk? I mean, really talk. I was sitting in Harold's study, surrounded by the awards and photographs that told the story of his business success. Our business success, I corrected myself. It was going to take time to adjust to thinking that way again. Of course, I said, though part of me wondered what we had to discuss. The damage was already done. He came over that evening alone. Jennifer had stayed home with their 2 children, which was probably for the best. This conversation needed to happen without an audience. I don't know where to start, Michael said, settling into the leather chair across from Harold's desk. He looked younger somehow, less sure of himself than the confident businessman who'd sat in Robert's office just days before. How about starting with why you never asked? I said, surprising myself with the directness of the question. Asked what? Asked how your father really built his company. Asked where the money came from. Asked why I seemed to know so much about the business if I was just a housewife. Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd inherited from his father. I guess I just accepted the story everyone told. Dad was this brilliant entrepreneur who built something from nothing. You were the supportive wife who made it all possible by taking care of the home front. And that story made sense to you? That a 26-year-old man with no family money and no business experience somehow convinced a bank to lend him enough to buy an entire manufacturing company. For the first time, Michael really looked at me. Not the polite, dutiful glance of a son checking on his aging mother, but the focused attention of someone trying to understand a puzzle they'd never noticed before. When you put it that way, it doesn't make sense at all, he admitted. But Dad always made everything sound so inevitable. Like his success was just natural talent and hard work. It was hard work, I said. Both of ours. We sat in silence for a moment, and I could see Michael processing 40 years of assumptions, trying to rebuild his understanding of his own family history. Mom, I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm sorry we let Ava say those things. I'm sorry we didn't defend you. I'm sorry we didn't know. I appreciated the apology, but something about it bothered me. Michael, you're 35 years old. Ava's been part of this family for 8 years. In all that time, did you ever once think to ask me about my life before you were born? About what I gave up to raise you and your brother? He looked down at his hands. I guess I assumed you'd tell us if it was important. And I assumed you'd ask if you cared. The truth of that statement hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. What can I do to make this right? Michael asked. Before I could answer, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. That's your brother, I said. I suspect he has questions too. David's call led to another visit, this one with Jennifer in tow. They brought my grandchildren, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Lucas, who ran straight to me with the uncomplicated love of children who hadn't yet learned to question anyone's worth. Grandma Karen, Emma shouted, wrapping her arms around my waist. Daddy says you're a business lady like Mommy. Out of the mouths of babes. Jennifer shot David a look, but I just smiled and hugged Emma back. I was sweetheart. A long time ago. After the children went to play in the backyard, David and Jennifer sat across from me in the living room. David looked more shaken than Michael had, perhaps because he'd always been more sensitive to the undercurrents in our family. Mom, he said. I've been thinking about all those times you knew things about the company that didn't make sense for someone who was supposedly just Dad's wife. Like when you corrected that journalist who got the founding date wrong, or when you knew exactly which clients were behind on payments. I nodded. I knew because I'd been involved from the beginning. Your father and I made most of the major decisions together, even if the world only saw his signature on the paperwork. Jennifer leaned forward. But why didn't you ever tell us? Why let people think Harold did it all alone? This was the question I'd been asking myself for 3 days. Why had I allowed my own story to be erased? Because I loved your father, I said simply. And because I believed that supporting his success was the same thing as sharing in it. I thought as long as our family prospered, it didn't matter who got the credit. But it did matter, David said quietly. It mattered to you, didn't it? I felt tears threatening again. Yes, it mattered. More than I let myself admit for a very long time. That evening after David and Jennifer left, I was surprised by another visitor. Ava stood on my doorstep, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd humiliated me in Robert's office. May I come in? She asked, her voice small. I considered saying no. The wound from her words was still fresh, still tender. But curiosity won out. We sat in my living room, the same room where she'd played with her children during family gatherings, where she'd complimented my cooking and asked for decorating advice. The same room where she'd apparently been judging me silently for years. I came to apologize, she said without preamble. What I said in Robert's office was unforgivable. Yes, it was, I agreed. There was no point in making this easier for her. Ava flinched but continued. I want you to understand I wasn't trying to be cruel. I genuinely believed that Harold had built everything alone, that you'd been lucky to marry a successful man. And where did you get that idea? She was quiet for a long moment. From David, actually. And Michael. They always talked about their father like he was this self-made genius. They never mentioned your contributions. This hit me harder than I'd expected. My own sons had inadvertently fed the narrative that I was just Harold's lucky wife. There's something else, Ava continued. I need you to know that part of my reaction came from jealousy. Jealousy. You have something I've always wanted, she said, not meeting my eyes. You had a real partnership with your husband. Even when I didn't know the business details, I could see that Harold respected your opinion, valued your input. David loves me, but he's never seen me as an equal the way Harold saw you. This confession surprised me. I'd always seen Ava as supremely confident, secure in her place in the family. I thought if I could diminish your contributions, she continued, it would somehow make my own marriage feel more substantial. I was wrong. I was petty and cruel, and I'm sorry. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation, but saw only genuine remorse and something that looked like shame. Ava, I said carefully, are you apologizing because you're sorry for what you said? Or because you found out I'm worth more than you thought? She met my eyes then, and I saw a flash of the honesty I'd never seen from her before. Both, she admitted. I'm sorry for what I said because it was wrong and hurtful. But I'm also sorry because I just learned that I attacked someone who could make my life very difficult if she chose to. At least she was being honest. What do you want from me? I asked. Forgiveness, she said quickly. And maybe some advice about how to be the kind of partner you were to Harold. I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, she wanted advice on marriage from the woman she'd just humiliated. But as I looked at her, sitting in my living room with her designer clothes and perfect makeup that couldn't quite hide the insecurity underneath, I realized something. Ava wasn't evil. She was just young and scared and trying to find her place in a family that had its own complex history. The kind of partner I was to Harold cost me 40 years of recognition for my own accomplishments, I said. Are you sure that's what you want? She considered this seriously. Maybe what I want is to find a way to be a partner without disappearing. Now that was an interesting thought. What would my life have looked like if I'd insisted on keeping my name on the business? If I'd demanded credit for my contributions? If I'd refused to fade into the background of Harold's success story? That's a conversation for another day, I told her. Right now, I need to figure out what I'm going to do with this newfound recognition. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Now that my family knew the truth, now that they understood my role in building the fortune they'd expected to inherit, what happened next? The answer to that question would determine not just my future, but theirs as well. 6 months later, I was sitting in a cafe in Tuscany, watching the morning sun paint the hills gold. when my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "The quarterly reports look good, Mom. The transition is going smoothly." I smiled and set the phone aside. The transition. That was what we were calling the complete restructuring of my life, as if it were a simple business matter rather than the seismic shift it actually was. After Robert's revelations, I'd spent 2 weeks in a strange kind of limbo. My family suddenly wanted to include me in every conversation, ask my opinion on every decision, treat me like the founding partner I'd apparently always been. It should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt hollow. They weren't seeing me, Karen, the woman who'd sacrificed her own dreams to build theirs. They were seeing Karen, the valuable business asset they'd nearly lost through their own ignorance. The attention felt almost as dehumanizing as the dismissal had. That's when I realized something that changed everything. I didn't want their recognition anymore. I didn't want to be Harold's co-founder, or the secret genius behind the empire. I wanted to be myself for the first time in 40 years. The decision came to me on a Tuesday morning as I sat in Harold's study, looking at 40 years of awards and photos that told his story but not mine. I picked up the phone and called Robert. "I want to sell my share of the company," I told him. There was a long pause. "Karen, are you sure? According to Harold's will and the documentation we've uncovered, you own 60% of Holloway Manufacturing." 60%. Harold's final gift to me had been ensuring that the controlling interest in the company would pass to its true co-founder. It was his way of making sure I'd never be dismissed again. "I'm sure," I said. "I want to sell to Michael and David. They can buy me out over time if they need to. I'll be generous with the terms." "May I ask why?" I looked around the study, at all the trappings of a success that had never quite felt like mine. "Because I've spent 40 years building someone else's dream. I want to see what it feels like to build my own." The conversation with my sons was harder than the one with Robert. Michael couldn't understand why I'd want to walk away from the company I'd helped create. "Mom, you could be CEO," he said, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "You could finally get the recognition you deserve." "But I don't want to be CEO," I told him. "I never did. That was Harold's dream, not mine." "Then what do you want?" David asked. It was such a simple question, but I realized I hadn't asked it of myself in decades. What did I want? "I want to travel," I said, surprising myself with the immediate certainty of the answer. "I want to see the places I used to dream about when I was 24 and saving money for adventures I never took. I want to write the book I never had time for. I want to learn Italian and take cooking classes and maybe buy a little house somewhere warm where I can watch the sunset every night." My sons exchanged glances, and I could see they thought this was some kind of midlife crisis brought on by grief and the shock of recent revelations. "Mom," Michael said gently, "maybe you should take some time to think about this. You don't have to make any major decisions right now." But I'd been thinking about it for decades without realizing it. Every time I'd watched Harold board a plane for another business trip, I wondered what it would feel like to be traveling for pleasure instead of duty. Every time I'd hosted another dinner party for his clients, I'd imagined cooking for people who appreciated me rather than just my husband's success. "I've had 40 years to think about it," I said. "I'm done thinking." The sale took 3 months to finalize. My lawyers negotiated a deal that would pay me in installments over 5 years, enough to live very comfortably while ensuring that Michael and David could afford to buy out my share without bankrupting themselves. Ava, to her credit, didn't try to talk me out of it. She came to see me the week before I was scheduled to leave for Italy, where I'd rented a small villa for the summer. "I still don't understand why you're doing this," she said as we sat in my nearly empty living room. Most of my furniture had been donated or given to the boys. I was keeping only what truly mattered to me, because staying would have meant spending the rest of my life being seen as Harold's widow instead of Karen the individual, I explained. "And I've been invisible long enough." She nodded slowly. "Will you stay in touch?" "Of course," I said, and meant it. Ava and I would never be close friends, but we'd reached an understanding. She was learning to demand recognition for her own contributions to David's career, and I was learning to put myself first for a change. The day I left for Italy, both my sons came to drive me to the airport. As we stood at the departure gate, I saw tears in David's eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said, hugging me tight. "I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. Michael nodded, his arm around my shoulders. Dad would be proud too. He'd understand why you need to do this. I thought about Harold as my plane lifted off, leaving behind the life we'd built together. Would he understand? I thought he would. After all, he'd been the one to document my contributions, to ensure I'd be recognized as his partner even after his death. Maybe he'd known this day would come. Now, 6 months later, I was writing in my journal every morning on the terrace of my rented villa, working on the novel I dreamed of writing when I was 24. The story was about a woman who discovers her own strength later in life, who learns that it's never too late to reclaim your identity. I'd made friends with other expatriates, Americans and Brits and Germans who'd all come to Italy seeking something they'd lost or never had. We cooked together, explored ancient villages, shared stories about the lives we'd left behind and the adventures we were discovering. Last week, I'd put an offer on a small house in the hills outside Florence. It needed work, but it had a view that took my breath away, and a garden where I could grow tomatoes and herbs and maybe learn to make my own wine. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo from Jennifer. Emma and Lucas making cookies in their kitchen, flour everywhere, huge grins on their faces. The message read, "They miss their Nana, but they're excited about visiting Italy this summer." I was excited too. For the first time in decades, I was excited about the future instead of just managing the present. The woman who'd sat in Robert's office 6 months ago, absorbing insults about her worthlessness, felt like a stranger to me now. That woman had been crushed under the weight of other people's expectations, diminished by years of putting everyone else's needs first. This woman, the one writing in her journal as church bells chimed across the Tuscan hills, knew exactly what she was worth. And it had nothing to do with business partnerships or financial contributions or anyone else's recognition. It had to do with the courage to start over at 66, to chase dreams that had been deferred for 40 years, to choose adventure over security and self-discovery over the comfortable prison of other people's approval. I closed my journal and walked to the edge of my terrace, looking out over the valley where olive groves stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter from a neighboring villa. The sound carried on the warm breeze that smelled of lavender and possibilities. For the first time in my adult life, I belonged entirely to myself. And it was the most beautiful inheritance I could have ever received.